Well, I think South Africa is obviously in a different league, and one of the messages of this book is this is a highly differentiated continent. We can't talk about Africa as being one thing. It's a highly differentiated continent. They're big countries, Nigeria, 200 odd million people, Ethiopia, over 110 million people, all the way down to tiny economies of the scale of Eswatini or Lesotho or Zanzibar for that matter, and then all the grades in between. There's some countries which are large in geographic size too, some countries which are obviously very tiny and concentrated. Rwanda has a density of a European country and European city in terms of its overall population density. So there's a great deal of difference, a great deal of heterogeneity, and it's impossible to say that there's one thing that fits all. But if there are some basic lessons, I think the first lesson applies as much to those giving aid, which South Africa does to some extent, to some of its neighborhood, as those receiving it, which is there is no magic formula here. There's no quick fix. There's no sudden way of changing this. This is a multi-generational project, and it's best that you start today, because otherwise you're going to delay it by a day. So you might as well start as quickly as possible. It's also about making very tough decisions, which of course you have to politically try and push through, but you use your mandate to do that. And I do think that the one challenge we have in South Africa is we use the mandates to stay in power rather than the mandates to progress development and use that power effectively. So we're more in the accumulation of power rather than leverage of power mode. And you're accumulating it for what? Ultimately, the ANC is going to lose support, and of course there's talk of the 50% threshold and all of this in terms of elections, because it's not making full use of the mandate that it has and the difficult choices that it has to make. The second big issue is that there have to be very difficult choices. And Africa, and South Africa is no different in this regard, has been, for the most part, there are exceptions to this rule, very poor at making those difficult choices. Leadership has made very rational choices, but choices that enabled it to stay in power, but essentially to condemn people to poverty in some instances, and in South Africa to a very low growth environment. So the critical choices here are about, who do you want to represent? The employed or the unemployed? As we head towards 50% unemployment, which is the more powerful constituency in this regard? Now, if you're a party that's been formed on the rump of union activism, you would say, well, it's the employed. So they're the ones who pay their dues, and they're the ones whose interests we're going to first and foremost look out for. But if you do that, you're almost condemning yourselves and the country to a low growth and certainly a low employment growth future. So I think that's the choice question is one that applies equally to South Africa in a different context that applies to other African countries. And then we have to use our resources sparingly and wisely. And what many African countries have done, rather like South Africa, but not on the same scale as South Africa, is consume rather than invest. To use your resources to finance consumption, to borrow very heavily, as we have done, drive up government debt, but not put that into enablers for economic development, into infrastructure, into power, ports, railways, etc., and into training. What we've done is we put it into civil service size and salaries. And that's certainly another very difficult choice that South Africa has to make in this regard. I'm generally an optimist. I'd like to believe that if you point out the choices, that people will make a rational choice in the interests of the country, in the interests of long-term economic development, which is essentially their children and their grandchildren. But we've become, I think our horizons have become shorter and shorter, and our interest has become more and more selfish over time in South Africa, more and more about our very narrowly defined sense of community rather than about people who don't have the same opportunities. So in a sense, there's another liberation that has to happen. It's not a liberation from apartheid and into democracy. It's a liberation from the old way of doing things. And that's the final probably parallel with the rest of Africa, in spite of all the differences, is you need to be liberated in a way that gets rid of the old ways of doing business, which was essentially a very extractive rather than inclusive investment model, very much based on commodity price cycles and a boom and bust nature. Now, South Africa's economy is not as vulnerable in that sense as others in Africa, but we are becoming increasingly vulnerable because we are deindustrializing at a tremendous rate, in part because of the nature of our workforce and the productivity of our workforce, and changes in that regard and cost of inputs into industry. But certainly we have to transform our economic model in a way that enables us to become more competitive and gives more and more people an opportunity, partly through education, but partly also through labor market practices and constraints that unfortunately have become sort of set pieces of ideology in our economy.